Hey, Sherry, can you promote um Councilmember Rainier? He is in as an attendee.
Yes. All right, we are live.
All right, perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming for our temporary digs here. Next time, we're gonna have a fancy party going on. But thank you all so much for coming. Appreciate it and for this important conversation. It is 4:01 on Wednesday, April 19th, 2023. And I now call to order the joint College Place and Walla City County Council workshop. Jerry, will you please take roll call?
Mayor Hernandez.
Present.
Mayor Scribner.
Present.
College Place, Councilmember Jessup.
Present.
Councilmember Cleveland.
Present.
Councilmember Espinoza.
Present.
Councilmember Peterson.
Present.
And Walla Council Members Esco.
Here.
Councilmember Casey.
Here.
Councilmember Reyna.
Here.
Councilmember Kohler.
Here.
Councilmember Nakanizi.
Here.
And Councilmember Moss.
Here.
Yeah. We do have a quorum for both of our councils. And we also have Chris Gonzalez from FCS Group, Angie Sanchez from FCS Group, and Alex Fazzari from GD Engineers. And College Place Council members Williams, Sherman, and Boyle have asked to be excused.
Great, thank you. All right, will you please join me in the pledge of allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We have some non-council members in attendance. Can staff of both cities please just do a quick introduction and what your role is?
Sure, Mike Rostello, City Administrator, City of College Place.
Hi, Brian Carlton, Finance Director, College Place.
Elizabeth Chamberlain, City Manager, City of Walla Walla.
Bob Francis, Deputy City Manager, City of Walla Walla.
Kai Buey, City Walla Walla Public Works Director.
All right, thank you. Francis, welcome.
Thank you.
And for your first but of many meetings of the joint council. So congratulations on your role and welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see, it's time for public comment. Did anyone submit a comment in advance?
I did not receive any comments.
Okay, is there anybody in attendance who would like to speak? If anyone is in virtual attendance and would like to speak, please raise your hand. If you're connected by phone, *9 will raise your hand. No, okay, then let's move on. We have workshop topics. We have one today and no action will be taken for discussion. Mr. Rizzatello, along with Mr. Gonzalez and Ms. Sanchez from FCS Group will present.
Sure, so I'll introduce this and FCS Group could take it from there. So premise this meeting is just to present on the various models of the wastewater ownership and then to get any questions out from both bodies that you may have about the wastewater treatment plant consolidation process. And after you go through a whole presentation and get all questions, if there still is the interest in doing this, and then if so, really forming a body, because the next step from this would really be visiting how some of these other regional districts do their business and learn about their on-site, because there's a number of them in the region. So with that, I will turn it over to FCS Group.
All right, thank you very much. I will
Actually, are you going to share the presentation on your screen or should I share it on mine?
I gave you the ability to share if you'd like to. Or I
Okay.
can do it.
So let's do this. All right, can everyone see the presentation?
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So just to provide a little bit of background, the Department of Ecology has required the city of College Place to upgrade its wastewater treatment plant as a condition of the NPDES permit. There are a series of improvements and upgrades that are identified as part of that upgrade process, and the estimated cost is about $26 million. The city expects to fund roughly half of that through grants and the other half through loans. The city of College Place approached the city of Walla Walla about sending its wastewater to Walla Walla's treatment plant instead of completing some of those upgrades. And both parties have expressed interest in evaluating the terms under which such a relationship could be mutually beneficial. So I'll start out by introducing the three models that we're going to look at. And they're broadly separable into three. One is the renter model, one is the customer model, and one is the partner model or the regionalization model. And that's the model that we understand that the city of College Place, the council prefers. I think this graphic here, what I'm trying to illustrate here is as these models vary in terms of the level of ownership and authority, but also in the corresponding level of financial commitment and responsibility and exposure to risk. And so I've shown it here with a curve because I don't think it's linear, but the slope of the curve is subject to situation-specific considerations. And so now I'll go over each of the models individually, and then we can talk about some examples. The renter model generally uses the utility-based rate-making approach. And I'll take a step back and say that industry standards, the Water Environment Federation, American Water Works Association, they typically specify two rate-making methodologies. And so one is the utility-based method, which is going to be featured in this model. And then the other is the cash-based rate-making approach, which is going to be featured in the customer model, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And so the key components of the rate-making approach for the utility basis method is that we're looking to recover a proportionate share of operating expenses, depreciation on the assets providing service, and then an equitable return or rent on the assets that are providing service. And this approach is customizable to reflect differences in the level of service that the customer would receive relative to other customers. And that's why it's commonly used to set wholesale and contract rates. There are various factors that need to be considered when determining rates under this approach, such as what are the assets providing service and what is the appropriate rate of return. Once we've assigned assets, how do we allocate them between the service provider and the renter? When we're computing rates, do we use forward-looking budget projections or do we use historical actual costs? And so there are arguments to make in favor of each of those approaches. If you use budget projections, generally speaking, true-ups would be in order. So ultimately, the customer or the renter in this case is going to pay for the equitable share of actual costs, not necessarily budget projections that could be high or low in practice. And then finally, frequency of updates and indexing. So how often do you want to calculate the rates versus establishing some type of index where you adjust for the consumer price index inflation or some other agreed upon index? The return on assets, the general formula, and I'll try not to get overly theoretical here, but in general, there's an allocated rate base and a rate of return. And so the rate base is typically defined as the net book value of utility funded assets. So we want to take out assets that the utility didn't fund, and we want to adjust for depreciation on those assets. And so that's part of the asset definition process. The rate of return is a key point of negotiation. So one approach would be, we say a fixed rate of return. So it'll be 6% or whatever the number is. The other approach is a return based on the weighted average cost of capital. And there are two components of that, including the debt component, which is linked to the average interest rate on outstanding debt for the utility. And then the equity component is an opportunity cost of investing cash in infrastructure versus investing it to earn a return or for some other purpose. And so there are different ways you can look at that. You can look at the average investment earnings rate for the utility, like what did they lose by not having the cash available. You could look at the current market interest rate for debt. So if you don't have the money available, you might have to borrow more. And then that might be an indicator of the cost. And then the question is there some kind of risk premium? And that's something that's usually negotiated. The advantages of the renter model for the renter is the cost to initiate service is the lowest. So there's the lowest barrier for entry. So typically a buy-in is not required. And when I say a buy-in, I mean like an upfront connection charge payment or something like that. The ongoing rates are generally the lowest of the three approaches or three models, as the renter is typically allocated only a subset of the costs based on the assets providing service. And then the renter in this model is less sensitive to capital funding decisions of the service provider. So because we look at operating expenses, depreciation, and return on assets, whether you issue debt, it won't have a direct impact on the revenue requirement. I mean, it will through the weighted average cost of capital that I went over on the previous slide if we end up going that approach. And likewise, if the utility wants to generate cash through rates to ramp up funding for capital projects, that's not going to directly hit the renter in this model. For the service provider, the advantage is that it provides a way to utilize the idle capacity while the retail customer base grows into it. And it allows you to spread the costs over a larger customer base. So that would be the key reason why the service provider would be interested in this model. The disadvantages of this model are that the renter, from their perspective, they don't own the capacity, and the availability is subject to renewal of the contract. Typically, there is a separate calculation because this method is not parallel to the method that the service provider uses to set retail rates. So there is a separate calculation and administrative process, and the costs tend to be passed on directly to the renter. And then there's also this us versus them political dynamic potentially with the service provider. So the service provider has incentive to make decisions that will increase what the renter pays so that what the retail customers pay can be less. From the service provider's perspective, the disadvantages are that there is a greater administrative burden of determining and reconciling renter rates. And so even if you do recover the cost from the renter, there's still the whole process of determining the rates and reconciling them and doing true-ups as appropriate. There may be capital investments needed to serve the renter, and those would be recovered from the renter over time. So that would be part of the asset or the rate base allocated to them, and they would pay for it through depreciation and the return on assets. There would be a temporary burden on the retail users as they have to pay for that upfront until they get reimbursed over time. And then there's a potential for retail rate impacts if the renter chooses not to renew the contract. And with that, the potential for stranded investments. So the fact that it's not a permanent commitment, it can work for the service provider and it can work against them in terms of the overall risk that they're subject to. Then we get to the customer model, and this, as I said before, uses the cash-based approach, which recovers operating expenses, debt service, capital funding, reserve funding. We know that as system reinvestment funding we generate through rates for capital. This is commonly used to set retail rates, and the factors that we typically consider: multi-year financial planning, So revenue requirements, we're not setting rates for 1 year. We look ahead to make sure that we can keep the rate increases moderate and predictable over time. Cost allocation methodology, in this case, we're talking about a cost of service analysis. So if the utility has residential and commercial and irrigation on the water side, but for sewer to be kind of commercial, industrial, multifamily, things like that, how do you allocate costs equitably to them? And then, if you are having the renter come on as a customer, or I should say the entity come on as a customer, the question comes, are you going to just charge them as commercial, or is there a meaningful difference in service where they merit their own customer classes? That would be something to consider. Rate structure priorities and objectives. So here, for example, revenue stability might be important. So that might lend itself to higher fixed charges versus consumption related charges. Equity and affordability might lead you in the direction of putting more on the volume charges and then having lower fixed charges. To the extent that there are cost increases or shifts among classes, there's the question of how do you phase those in over time, and that's a policy call. And then also the frequency of updates and indexing comes into play. So, are you looking at revenue requirements every year or every 2 years? Maybe you're looking at cost of service every 5 years or something like that. And in between rate updates, maybe you're indexing the rates to inflation. And so the advantages of the customer model to the customer in this case is that there's a permanent capacity commitment, and it helps with long-term planning. So you don't have to worry about whether the capacity is going to be there. And because of that, regulatory agencies might prefer that. And so it's also less sensitive to politically driven rate-making decisions of the service provider, because the rates are based on the same methodology used to set rates for the other users. So there's not going to be a big shift toward the customer here, as opposed that would not affect the other customers, I guess I would say. And then from the service provider's perspective, the capacity commitment is permanent, and there's a reliable source of revenue, and it's the simplest model to administer. There's a uniform methodology that applies to all users. The disadvantages from a customer's perspective is that there's a buy-in typically required. That'd be a connection charge. It can be paid up front, or maybe if allowed by the service provider, it could be paid over time, maybe through a rate surcharge or something. The rates are generally higher than those in the renter model. They reflect system-wide costs instead of costs isolated to the assets providing service. And then the rates are more sensitive to things like, how much capital funding the city want or the service provider want to generate through rates. So that plays into that model. A disadvantage to the service provider is that the capacity commitment is permanent, and it may reduce capacity available for other users. And it may require incremental investments that have to be recovered from all ratepayers. So it's not the us versus them. We're sort of all in the same boat and doing what's necessary to meet everybody's needs. The partner model, or the regionalization model, under this model, a separate entity would serve both agencies, and this would likely be a joint municipal utility services authority under RCW 39.106. The rate-making approach would be primarily cash-based, like the customer model, but it could integrate aspects of the utility-based approach as well. The factors considered when determining rates, the multi-year financial planning, kind of like the customer model, and then also the cost allocation methodology. So how are you allocating operating costs, and how are you allocating capital costs? And that likely needs to be specified by the agreement. And then other factors to consider, there are significant costs and processes involved with the formation, operation, and administration of a separate entity. And then you also have to define what the regional system is. Is it just a treatment plant? Is it is there a transmission system that would have to be, where there would be interceptors? Do you just want it to be one big sewer district that provides full service to both cities? That would be an option as well. The advantages of the partner model, again, from the College Places perspective, is that the commitment is permanent. or would be permanent, and for the same advantages under the customer model. And then there would also be greater economies of scale. So the cost can be spread over a greater number of users, and the regional entity can qualify potentially for additional state and federal funding. There's at least one agency, lot, that was formed specifically to take advantage of those opportunities. And from Walla Walla's perspective, this would also allow it to spread its own costs out over a greater number of users, and kind of the same advantage of qualifying for outside funding. The disadvantages of the partner model in both cases is that there's the process requirements, cost, time, effort, and all that to form a regional entity. For College Place, a disadvantage, voting power would tie directly to the financial stake in the system. And the way that this generally plays out is based on capacity shares. And so based on College Place's system planning documents versus Walla Walla's, College Place would represent about 15 to 20% of the flows and loadings. And so based on that representation, we'd be looking at maybe one board member on a 5-member board, being College Place, and then the other 4 being Walla Walla. So there's limited say. You'd have some say, but would not necessarily be an equal partnership. And it doesn't make sense for it to be an equal partnership based on the relative need for capacity. There's also a buy into regional system assets. There are some models where I'll go over later where there wasn't a system in place and it was founded, and then kind of the partners went together in developing things. But in this situation, that's not the case. There's Walla Walla already has an established system, so there would need to be a buy-in to whatever the assets were defined for that regional system, and that could exceed the cost of the improvements at the College Place treatment plant that we talked about on the first slide. And then the allegation of ongoing costs, there'd be additional administrative costs for the regional entity, assuming that there'd be different, incremental staffing requirements over who's working for the cities now. In Walla Walla specifically, there'd be some loss of control over the wastewater system, even though Walla Walla would likely retain the majority of the voting power, given its capacity share, and then just the additional administrative costs for the regional entity. It might offset some of those by savings and its own operating costs if it's not having to directly, manage the operation of the plant. And so now we can talk about some governance models in the wild, or real world examples. Here's the slide showing the spectrum between renter, customer, and partner. And they really fall all over the place. I think that if you take nothing else away from this slide, I would say just understand in the real world, most of the models don't fall neatly into one of those categories. There's usually some hybridization of different models. But having said that, the ones that would be closest to the renter model would be the City of Vancouver and Clark Regional Wastewater District. Vancouver, the rate methodology for Clark Regional Wastewater District, they pay under that utility-based approach. And so it sort of models it pretty closely. They don't own the system, they're basically contracting to use it. And then the City of Longview and Beacon Hill Water and Sewer District, that arrangement is actually a little complicated because they are partners on the treatment plant, the water treatment plant for supply, and then they are not partners for transmission. So Beacon Hill pays a wheeling rate to Longview to use its transmission infrastructure to get the water to their service area. So that's why they appear twice on that chart. Somewhere between the renter and the customer model is the City of Blaine and Birch Bay Water and Sewer District. And so the City of Blaine generally owns the system, and Birch Bay pays a utility-based structure like the renter model, but they pay connection charges for new connections that they add to the system. And so there's some buy-in. So there is some ownership between connection charges, and I think they also donated a well to the system. But largely they're a renter model, but somewhere between renter and customer. the city of Chehalis, and then the city of Napavine and Lewis County Sewer District 4, they're kind of also between renter and customer. And I should say that where they show up on this chart is also a function of where I could fit it in and have it be legible. So it's not like, one is dramatically more, along than the other. But so under that approach, Chehalis and Napavine and Lewis County Sewer District, they're large. Sorry, was there a question?
No.
Okay. And so Napavine and Lewis County Sewer District, they basically, there's a methodology, a contract methodology for allocating operating costs to them. And that's basically what the rate structure recovers. And so it's definitely a different calculation than how Chehalis sets its retail rates. But it doesn't include all of the elements that would make it the renter model. And then we go to the customer model. Spokane County and the town of Millwood is a pretty direct example of that one. Millwood has a contract flow. It's like 150,000 gallons a day roughly, and Spokane County equates that to equivalent residential units or ERUs based on the standard definition, and they just pay the rate per ERU for the number of ERUs that they're assigned, and so that relationship is fixed. And then Sumner and Bonnie Lake, they're somewhere between partner and customer. Sumner officially owns a treatment plant, but Bonnie Lake is paid a connection charge into it. Both cities operate their own collection systems. And then Bonnie Lake there's a contract methodology for allocating it operating and capital costs. And then we talked about Longview and Beacon Hill already. So then getting kind of to the bigger three agencies, Clean Water Services is down in Oregon. They started as a regional sewer utility that then grew to encompass multiple aspects of water quality and water resource management. And so they provide a combination of regional services to bigger cities, and then they provide direct services to smaller cities that are within their service area. So they do kind of both. And then you get to Lot Clean Water Alliance, and Lot is Lacey, Olympia, Tumwater, and Thurston County Clean Water Alliance, which was actually originally formed from the city of Olympia's wastewater utility. And then eventually it emerged as its own entity. And the purpose of that was in part to take advantage of federal funding opportunities. And each of the partners, I think, has donated some infrastructure to the regional system, and it operates as a completely separate entity. And then Cascade Water Alliance is a pretty direct example of the partner model. It consists of 7 members, so Bellevue, Kirkland, Redmond, Issaquah, Tukwila, Sammamish Plateau Water, and then Skyway Water and Sewer District. And they have a board with a representative from each agency. However, the votes are weighted based on the demand shares. And so when I say a demand share, they calculate it based on a rolling average of historical demand, primarily during the peak period. So it's really capacity shares. And so what happens is Bellevue is over half of the system's demand, so they get over half the vote. And so there's a political dynamic that creates where, I mean, Bellevue, if it can veto pretty much anything that it wants to, but has to work with the other partners to get anything done. And Cascade has its own operating budget, its own capital budget, and those costs are all passed on to the members through ongoing rates. So in summary, there are a variety of governance models, likely some combination of them. I mean, ultimately, the model can be whatever the parties are willing to agree to, so long as it isn't illegal. And yeah, there's a lot of range, as you can see here. But in general, regardless of the model, greater power and authority generally requires greater financial commitment and exposure to risk. And so the overall goal is to manage that risk and ensure that each agency that participates contributes equitably to system costs. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, let's go to council members for any questions, and we'll start with Walla Walla's. Councilmember Casey, any questions or comments?
Only that, so what you're forecasting is the closest to this model example is what you're thinking about, which governance.
So, I mean, I'm sorry. go ahead.
Millwood? Excuse me, go ahead.
I was just saying, like, we are not in a position where we're advocating for one of these or the other. I mean, really what this is about is, showing here are the pros, here are the cons. This is, there's a wide range of how this could work. So the real question is, what is the trade-off? I mean, from College Place's perspective, what is the trade-off? How much voting power do you want versus how much money are you able and willing to pay? And then from Walla Walla's perspective is how much control potentially are you willing to give up? And what are you willing to allow College Place to even buy into?
I see. I did kind of like the idea, once you get this all set up and then you have a customer come on, then that would change it individually. But that's all I think.
Councilmember Esco.
Yeah, I'm just curious, you were talking about the Cascade Water Alliance with Bellevue having the lion's share and all that. Does that really matter? I mean, do they have any problems?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Will they have any problems with one agency, with one city having so much control as compared to that? I mean, does that really matter?
The question, well, it matters depending on where the relative interests are. So I think Bellevue has the same interests as the other members in terms of making sure that supply is available and that they're able to meet their needs. But I mean, as far as a board, I mean, like your city councils, I mean, you vote on certain decisions and whatnot, and basically, if Bellevue wants to. If for some reason Bellevue's interests differ from other members, their vote can overpower other members. So Bellevue and Skyway Water and Sewer District are not going to have anywhere near the same say.
But is the issue, is it really just the rates and the fees, or is it something else that I don't understand that people would care about control so much about?
Well, I mean, it would be even the decisions that impact the rates and the fees. So, I mean, an example of Cascade Water, what they might have to do is, so in their supply planning, they have a supply portfolio, and they're looking at a blend of sources as to how they're going to meet their future demands. And so ultimately, the plan can make a recommendation, but the board has to approve the plan, and the board has to approve, decisions for Cascade to enter negotiations with Seattle or Tacoma or not. And so those kinds of decisions, I mean, the board gets to vote on, and Bellevue's vote could turn things over in a way that isn't necessarily favored by the other members. But I mean, if the relationship is good, and everybody's on the same page, it doesn't really matter. But if there are political dynamics where you don't necessarily have two fully willing participants, then it matters more.
Right. Well, that would be, I guess, in some cases, in this situation, Walla would have a bigger share. So have you heard of any of these situations where there's like a big blow up and they split and they have to go through all that?
I have not heard of that. I will say that the interlocal agreement for Cascade Water Alliance outlines specific terms for what happens if Cascade dissolves. I mean, basically the costs get allocated to the member agencies because someone has to pay them. I mean, if you undid a regional organization, you have to have an interlocal that specified all that. And that's part of the complexity of setting one up, is to make sure that you've crossed all those I's and cross all those T's and dot all those I's.
And my last question is, in the situation with Walla and College Place, I can see College Place's population growing faster than Walla's, per capita, situation. So how do you fix that then as one grows faster than the other?
That's quite simple. So basically, there have to be some discussion about connection charges and how College Place contributes to that. As College Place grows, it will contribute more to that, and then I mean over time, its capacity share would increase. And so, if I made the extreme example that College Place eventually grows to be the same size as Walla Walla, they would eventually get equal say. They would have equal representation. But yeah, I mean, it sort of depends on the scale. It's like, yeah, College Place could grow at twice the rate that Walla Walla is growing, but it would take quite a while to reach Walla Walla's size.
Councilmember Colder.
Thank you, Mayor. My question is about timeframes and costs. Do the timeframe and cost match the arch of the graph?
Yeah. So towards the beginning of the presentation, I had mentioned that the curve, I have it there conceptually, but it's subjective. I mean, really, it'll depend on multiple things. I mean, if for some reason, Walla Walla and College Place have a really hard time, negotiating terms that they can both agree to, and there are multiple rounds of back and forth and administrative requirements. I mean, that could potentially be greater. And I will say that this graph, as I set it up, it wasn't necessarily intending to focus specifically on the formation. But that being said, I mean, the formation cost and requirements would go into that financial commitment responsibility aspect of the graph.
Well, my question is moreover, as you move from renter to partner, that the cost for buy-in and the time to negotiate probably increases.
Yes, I would. My guess is the customer model, it wouldn't be that big of a difference, and I think it would grow exponentially to the partner, because there's a lot. I mean, Walla Walla already has service terms for the customers that it serves, and so I mean, there might be some things that need to be negotiated because of the scale of College Place relative to other customers, but largely there's an existing model there, and then moving to the separate agency, there's a whole bunch of new stuff that would need to be worked out. And that's where that incremental cost and time would come in.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Moss.
Mayor, thank you. Chris, a lot of information. So if some of these things are generally understood, and apologies, but while you haven't seen any disbanding of organizations, have you seen any that started which rental model and then moved up to customer and then finally into a partnership?
Well, I wouldn't say the partner one, but I would say, for example, the Blaine and Birch Bay Water and Sewer District model was originally the pure renter. And then I think it was around 2009, they talked about wanting to do kind of that joint connection charge. And so Birch Bay was buying into the system to help with that partnership. And so then they started paying the connection charge, and that kind of puts them closer to that customer model, but they're still kind of on the renter side. And I think, I mean, for what it's worth, informally, they do coordinate and work together for supply planning, but there's not a separate organization that does that.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess thinking about Lot when it was originally tied to the city of Olympia, I mean, maybe there you might argue, and from that perspective, there's one that's not on here, the city of Edmonds, and then it has several agencies that it as a partner with at its treatment plant, wastewater. There's the city of Shoreline, and let's see, Olympic View Water Sewer District, and then there's another one that's escaping me at the moment. But basically, Edmonds owns and manages the plant, and then the cost of the plant then get allocated to the members of that, or the partners of that plant, based on an agreed upon methodology. It's tied to capacity. So, and I don't know how that one has evolved over time. But yeah, I mean, my experience is when you might move from renter to customer, but usually there's a specific motivation to create a separate organization.
Have you ever seen a model regress? Go from partnership back to customer?
I have not seen anything like that, because I feel like once the model is done, and I mean, the system is working, I don't know. I mean, maybe I guess if there be less cost to the quote unquote customer that then would become a customer. Yeah, I've not seen that. I mean, I suppose, well, I guess if Cascade Water Alliance were to dissolve, you then have 7 members that have to figure something out. But yeah, I mean, I don't know that anyone has gone from the customer to the renter model. Usually, you know, if an agency is willing to extend the customer commitment, and the renter is willing to take it, then they sort of agree on that. And I think from the renter's perspective, I mean, if you already paid a connection charge and you already sort of have an ownership level on par with the other customers, I don't know if there's really a reason to go back from that and start paying rent on assets.
Logically, I can understand that sometimes divorces happen.
Yeah, they do. I mean, I guess in your case, what would happen is if this organization, if you created a regional organization and then it dissolved, I mean, both agencies would have to figure out what to do. And I mean, I would assume that in the agreement, Walla Walla would say, if the organization dissolves, like, or yeah, even College Place, like everybody gets back the assets that they donated to the organization. But then that would leave College Place kind of having right back where it is now.
Chris, what's the longest duration of any kind of model that you're familiar with?
I've heard that contracts can't last forever. I'm trying to think.
Was Olympia the first, or Edmonds, or are we talking 20 years? 25 years?
I think it would be longer than that. Like Lot, I think, has been in place for longer than that. I could dig up their interlocal, but then it also changed, I think, after they became a fully separate organization. But I know, like, for example, Cascade, you know, they're doing like a 50-year plan. So I would assume that the contract's good for at least that.
And then if we were to move to the next step, logically, in your mind, what would that be? Forming a committee, a joint committee to start to.
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, yeah, the committee is a good idea, you know, talking, I mean, especially with College Place being interested in the partner model. I think it would be a good idea to talk to some of those agencies over there and kind of see, like, you know, how do they operate? What dynamics do they have to deal with? From the analytical perspective, I think the next step would be to see like what it would look like. And you know, I think that the partner model, I mean, we could certainly focus on that, try to say, well, what would a buy-in look like? And what would a capacity share thing look like? And just try to, because I feel like it'd be hard to make a decision without knowing the financial implications of that decision.
That makes sense. And expectation wise, if again, there was a meeting of the minds to move forward, is this a 2-year, a 3-year kind of?
I want to say Cascade Water Alliance, one of our co-founders, Ed Sebrin, was also involved with the founding of that organization. And we have files that go back, I think, to 1999. And Cascade sort of officially got rolling in 2003. So it was 4 years.
Thank you very much.
We're gonna go online to council members, but Mayor Scribner has his hand raised. Mayor Scribner.
Thank you. And I lowered it because Councilmember Moss asked my question. I wanted to ask Chris if the 2 entities decided today that they wanted to form a partnership or something close to a partnership agreement, how long would that take, assuming normally anticipated disagreements and areas to work out? And I heard you say in response to the question from Councilmember Moss that it could be, we're talking maybe 4 years, correct?
Yes. Yeah, and that's one data point. I mean, there were also more people, more hands at the table there. Maybe it might be less, maybe it might be more, depending on the things that need to be worked out and the relative willingness or flexibility of each party in working those things out.
So if College Place were under some deadline imposed by some other entity and didn't have 3 or 4 years to work to form a partnership, we could, I guess, if both sides agreed, enter into a renter or a customer or a hybrid agreement to facilitate their meeting that deadline imposed by the third party and still work toward forming a partnership. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would say, yeah, I mean, the terms of that would have to be negotiated, but I mean, it could be, maybe it could be a renter model for a couple of years, or it could be similar to the customer model. I mean, part of it, I think it would be better to avoid large upfront buy-ins until you know kind of how, if and how that will work. So maybe the renter model might be the best one as kind of an interim. You're not fully committed to this, but we're buying time. And another option might be, as the regulatory agency, that deadline approaches, if you can show that there's considerable progress, maybe you could, get an extension or something to finish that up.
If the two parties wanted to move forward, irrespective of the model right now, I'm assuming that you would recommend that we jointly hire a facilitator to assist us in those negotiations. And would that be you, or do you have some recommendations? And I'm not asking for specific names, but just a suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, it would be good to have third parties involved, people with experience. I don't know that we would be the only one to do it, but I think we could certainly help advise and run scenarios on the financial stuff to help inform decision-making.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you. Councilmember Nekonisi.
All my questions have been answered. Thank you.
Councilmember Reyna.
I think if I best understand our ability to create some level of customization given this spectrum, and the city of College Place has expressed a preference for this partner model. It seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but the actual answer will depend really on the analysis of that preference and some of the pluses and minuses on that. And then, but necessarily we don't have to really fit precisely into any of this. We might even create a customized solution that may be none of the above. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So that analysis will be really interesting for both cities to understand where do we see the pluses, the minuses, the upside, et cetera, correct?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
And that's another reason, just really quickly, that's another reason why I would hesitate to say, oh, we recommend this model or that model or the other, because I mean, it would depend on the 3 specific deals that are on the table, and and really what everyone's aversion to risk is, what their willingness to take on financial responsibility is, and so it's just it's too conceptual at this point.
Councilmember Jessup.
Thank you for giving us a pretty concise, clear presentation. Appreciate it, Chris. And it seems to me like some of the questions, you're a little bit avoiding us a little bit, so I'm hoping to rephrase it. If I had limited time, if I had limited money, and we're just trying to get some sort of foundational framework in our brains, which one of these, or which 2 or 3 of these do you think we would focus our attention to get the most bang for our buck, to kind of get our heads wrapped around kind of comparable situations to Walla and College Place?
Okay, so so I'm not intentionally dodging, so I will try to I will try to take this one as head on as I can. Okay, so I guess to be as blunt as I can be, the partner model, the one that College Place wants, or the council wants at this point, I think we need to put numbers to it and show what that number would be. And if we're saying, oh, it's $40 million that you have to fork up for this, and I pull that number out of nowhere, then, the question is, do we go back to the drawing board? And, does the customer model, meet College Place's needs versus what College Place wanted? And so I think, we could certainly investigate all of those options. I would say, the renter model, an advantage of the renter model, even though there are some administrative costs for the rate calculations and such, is that it's flexible. And if you wanted to work through these things and take a while, that gives you the greatest flexibility. And by not requiring a buy-in, you can just basically pay for the assets as you use them. And then, if you want to move to a higher level of commitment, you can basically see if that relationship works out, for multiple years, how does it go? And is this something that you want to, get your permanent capacity commitment from? And then I think it's also kind of driven by what ecology is willing to accept. And so the renter model, I guess you could specify a term on the contract and then terms for amending it. But
So which one of these that I'm looking at, the governance model examples, which one or two or three of these you think would be best for us to zone in or hone in on, take a look at their contract, that would be best for us to kind of best allocation of our time?
So I guess the one that you want, I would say the partner one would go first, the regionalization model. And I would say we need, what's that?
So look at Cascades.
Yeah. And then the other ones, I'd say we should prepare those as backup calculations in case the partner model gives you an infeasible answer.
Thank
you, Mayor.
All right, I just want to remind, in the meeting that there's water and some snacks back there. Please feel free to help yourself at any time. Okay, Councilmember Cleveland.
Yeah, just so that I kind of I'm accurate in my overview of everything here. City of College Place is looking at doing around $20 million worth of upgrades to our wastewater treatment plant. We got the funding for that. But we're thinking here in the next few years, we can bring up current standards, but if those standards get stricter, we might be forking out a whole lot more money. And in addition, City of Walla would also be looking at forking out a whole bunch of extra money in order to bring it to additional potential standards that can come out. So we're thinking if we can create this regional entity, it would benefit both of us. And if we created an independent entity, we wouldn't be subject to any potential, political rivalries. And we'd have, as I understand it, one rate charged to across the board to everyone. So it's not like there's a specific rate to just College Place and a different one for City of Walla. It's just the people that would be in this independent entity aren't really thinking in terms of College Place or Walla. They're thinking in terms of the entire system and say, this is what needs to be done for the entire system. Is that pretty accurate? Am I wrong on any?
It is, but I would correct the last statement in that, assuming that Walla Walla and College Place are receiving the same level of service and have made commensurate contributions to the system, then yes, they should all pay the same rate. But for an example of where they might not pay the same rate, is if the negotiation says, all right, College Place, here's a connection charge that you should pay, and we will allow you to amortize it over time. And so it becomes a rate surcharge. But yeah, in general, I think the rate structure, like Cascade Water Lines, for example, their rate structure consists of an administrative charge per meter equivalent, a conservation program charge per meter equivalent, and then they have a demand share charge. And the rates themselves are the same. And then, each party has its own sort of values that the rate applies to determine what they pay. But the rate structure for the same class of service should be the same, yes.
Okay. I have some more specific questions regarding, you mentioned the proportional voting. Is that determined by the revised code of Washington specifically, this is how we do it, there's no other options? Or could it be done College Place selects a representative, City of Walla selects a representative. Other members on, say, a 5-person board would be employees of the partnership or as part of the employees within the regionalization organization.
Yes, there's plenty of flexibility. Like Lot, for example, I'm pretty sure that each agency has one board vote. And they're equal. And I don't think Olympia, Lacey, Tumwater, and Thurston County are all the same size. I think so. They did that. There are also committees and boards that have people that are not necessarily elected officials. So it comes down to what is negotiated in setting up the organization.
Okay. I guess one final question. Presumably, if we did move toward regionalization, we created this entity, and let's say City of Walla feels like, hey, there's certain things about the system within our areas that we feel are being neglected. What kind of legal recourse would they have? Would they like sue the independent organization? Kind of what would be some of the steps that would be taken to resolve concerns like that?
Well, I think I hate to keep deferring to the agreement, but I mean, typically like contracts specify mediation and dispute resolution. I mean, I suppose in theory, the city of Walla Walla could sue the regional organization in that case, but I mean, an example that I can speak to from in person is, Sammamish Plateau Water is supposed to have a certain number of connections from King County for the regional wastewater treatment system. And they are underserved, and they have been lobbying King County to basically invest in the infrastructure needed to increase those number of regional system connections because they're having their own conveyance capacity issues. And it's been a long process of negotiating. And I don't think it's gone to court yet, but I'm sure there are feelings on both sides from that. And but yeah, I mean, I think that would be a matter for the attorney to chime in on. But if they are contractually obligated to provide you with a service and they're not doing it, then there should be recourse to that.
All right, so I don't think I have any other questions. Thank you very much.
We're gonna go online to Councilmember Espinosa.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I think it's great that the two cities can come together to tackle such big issues as this. So thank you, everyone. I have a few questions that I wrote down, so I hope that we can have enough time to go through them. So the first one is, I know that we have to make a $26 million investment for the city of College Place to increase the capacity of our wastewater as we grow. What is the amount of an investment that Walla Walla has to make to their infrastructure in terms of their water system plan?
That is not a question that I know the answer to.
Okay.
Kai,
Alex, can you answer that question?
Well, I can tell you that what's in the currently approved plan for Walla Walla, I don't remember off the top of my head, but they do have planned improvements over the next 5 or 6 years to the wastewater treatment plant. And then another thing to keep in mind is that there's a plan to do a facility plan sometime in the next few years to do an overall comprehensive review of the treatment plant. That'll have a much better idea of how many upgrades and what the costs are for the upgrades over the next 20 years.
Do you have a ballpark figure of what that would entail, those upgrades?
I don't have it in front of me right now, but I think it's somewhere in the order of magnitude of around $20 million of planned improvements in the next 5 or 6 years.
Okay. Pretty sizable amount as well. So the second thing is, I know we're talking the conceptual models here, but do we know what the investment would look like under each one of the models for the city of College Place for now? In light of the $26 million, what would the renter customer partner initial investment look like?
So that's a great question. So I remember when we were first tasked to, or we first brought on into this discussion, we came up with a proposal to look at all that, and then we took a step back collectively, the team, and said that it would be good to talk through these models first before kind of delving into what that might actually look like. I can say that the renter model in general would not necessarily require any upfront cost aside from whatever infrastructure you would need to deliver the wastewater to the Walla treatment plant.
Excellent. And then just a couple more questions.
Member Espinosa, one quick moment. I think my.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Chris was just touching on this, but some of the discussion prior to this presentation was, and this really sets the stage for, here's some 3 different options, and there's all kinds of varieties in between, but it sets the stage conceptually for a couple of options. So what Chris had mentioned is a scope of work that we had developed in advance of this to actually look at, for example, with the best known information we have today, because understanding that there will be new permits, there will be new regulations, and regulations change, but what do we know today? What would be a cost under the renter model, the customer model, and potentially under the partner model, which is a little bit more complicated, but what would be a cost? Because really one of the key decision points for College Place, as I understand it, is it financially advantageous to go down that path versus going down your own path? That's really the decision that needs to be made. But to give an overview was the purpose of this presentation, to decide, should we now look at this from a cost standpoint to compare, okay, do we go our own way? Do we pursue the renter option? Do we pursue the customer option? Which direction do we want to go? When the College Place Walla JUB team met, we wanted to set it up in such a way that there were off ramps too. So you weren't absolutely locked in and you have no choice but to go this way. So kind of taking steps towards that direction of the partnership, understanding that maybe a ways down the road, but you need to make a decision on, is this advantageous for both Walla and College Place under these various models, and how advantageous? It's a really good question with the caveat of understanding the best known information we have today. What are the investments that Walla has to make? What are the investments that College Place has to make? And kind of comparing that in those different models versus in the future, College Place knows, hey, you have to make you could face some pretty significant investments. How does this compare to that? Is really what you have to wrestle with. Does that help?
I think that's a good point. And as we look at the cost benefit analysis, understanding what that looks like in terms of numbers will be very helpful. But thank you for that explanation. So my next question, Chris, would be, things happen, people disagree, cities disagree. Is there a contingency plan for a fallout in case something were not to work in the partnership of the 2 cities in this program?
Well, and I think that's something that would have to be negotiated as part of the agreement to form the agency. Because I think, like I mentioned before, there'll be a bunch of assets that effectively Walla will be selling, donating, I'm not quite sure, to this organization. And then if it dissolves, the question, what happens to the assets? Well, logically, and if College Place extends a main to serve to get wastewater to the treatment plant, then it shouldn't be without its investment either. So the agreement would really have to specify what would happen in the case of dissolution.
Okay, thank you. And then the other one that I was thinking about, is there a transition plan? Let's say we start at the renter model and then we want to move on to the customer model. Is that something that could be built into the agreement to look down the years as populations grow?
I'm sure it could be. I think it would come back to the agreement and specifying, how can the agreement be amended? And if the service requirements change and College Place comes to the table and says, all right, Walla, we want more. And then Walla gets to decide, do we want to offer more and sort of have that back and forth. There's still that dynamic if you're in the renter model where if you're not giving a buy-in, you don't really own anything long-term. And so that would be something to reconcile. And there are hybrid models where you pay the rates based on the renter model, but you are making buy-ins, like Birch Bay Water and Sewer District there. And there are sort of more permanent capacity rights.
Excellent. And the last comment I'd like to make is, as a customer, in Citizens, which from a customer experience perspective, which one do you have any surveys as far as which model has worked the best for citizens, across the board as we look at this chart here with all the municipalities?
That would be really hard. So I will say one thing about my experience working for, like, say, Cascade Water Alliance and its member agencies. It becomes easy when there's another organization to blame rate pressures on that organization. So, so for example, if you look at, a city over here in King County, they have a sewer rate increase. And it's like, oh, it's a 15% sewer rate increase, but that's because of King County's rate, going up or whatever. And so there's always that factor. I don't know that customers really have an appreciation for one of these over the other. It's sort of like what costs them the least. I mean, from that perspective, the customer model would give the system more revenue from the service provider's perspective, and their customers would like that better. But then from the renter or the customer's approach, then that increased investment has to be paid somehow. And so, if we're looking at College Place here, the customers might prefer the renter model because they want the lowest cost. But, are they prepared for what will happen if the capacity is no longer available?
Thank you.
Alan, feel free to join in if we ask a question or if you think you might have an answer for it.
Sure.
We're kind of like mixing in some of our questions. Because we're not sure what belongs where. So.
Right, sure.
Councilmember Peterson.
Well, what can I say here? I'm gonna be a little Pollyannish and say we're all gonna get along fine in the future, and things will work out great. I think it's really exciting here. We're putting some paint on the barn and we're moving right along, and it's I don't have any other questions that haven't already been raised. Thank you.
Okay. What about staff? Mike, you have anything you want to?
Well, I just wanted to direct this for Alex to answer, but it's kind of Councilmember Cleveland made having to do about the phasing and really what's bringing up the need for all of this. So phase one, we're funded for, and we have land for, and we can do. And the boogeyman in the room is really the future phases of 2, 3, and 4 due to the cost, land needs and everything else. So if you could extrapolate on that a little bit, just so everyone can understand that, because the phase one we can do ourselves. It's just the future phases are paused for concern as they currently stand.
Sure, yeah. So the phase one project is currently approved by Ecology for College Place's wastewater treatment plant. It totals about $26 million, and it meets the condition of the permit in terms of eliminating the discharge to Garrison Creek during the off season when it shouldn't be occurring. So it essentially, there's some miscellaneous upgrades at the treatment plant, but it also involves building a large storage pond so there's a place to store water when they can't be discharged to the creek. It involves some disinfection upgrades. It involves a bunch of upgrades to the land treatment system as well for irrigation. So the heart of the project really was to eliminate the discharge to Garrison Creek when it isn't allowed. And so the idea of instead maybe pumping some of that water to Walla in lieu of the storage pond and in lieu of some of the irrigation upgrades is really what we're talking about here. The phase one upgrade, as is currently approved with the storage pond and everything, meets College Place's needs for the foreseeable future. we have yet to get a new permit. So I think that's another important factor to realize here. Both Walla Walla and College Place are waiting for permit updates. And the big issue in the potential permit updates has to deal with PCBs. There is a risk at some point with a new permit upgrade that the PCB requirements might either preclude any discharge to Garrison Creek at any time of the year, which is what would trigger these super expensive phases 2 and 3 upgrades at College Place. Or it might require some very expensive treatment to the effluent before it can be applied to Garrison Creek. So that is an unknown. And that unknown is what is weighing on College Places. We don't know what that is. We don't know the timing of it. And so that makes it a difficult decision. So whereas phase 1 as currently approved and funded makes College Place whole and happy for the foreseeable future, the unknown is the future permit condition. Walla Walla is in the same boat. They have a PCB compliance issue in their existing permit as well. And there are still some things that ecology is working out in terms of what that really means and what the real requirements will be. And one thing that has changed since we have done College Places facility plan is the best known treatment for the PCBs. It wasn't really known before. Since then, the city of Spokane has built a certain filtration system that appears to be filtering out the PCBs. It is a very expensive treatment system. And so in the big picture, I think, and Councilmember Cleveland alluded to this, if the two treatment plants come together as a joint entity, the cost of that future project to treat PCBs is the one that could be spread amongst all the users. And rather than College Place building a filtration system and Walla Walla building a filtration system, build one in the same place and have an economy of scale. That's kind of the big picture issue in terms of future phases that we're talking about trying to avoid.
Okay. Mr. Carlson, you have any questions or comments?
I don't know.
Guys, got it.
Oh,
Alex, is there potential for College Place to kind of put this discussion on hold, given, you're ready to go with your phase 1 with an understanding that those future phases should trigger this kind of discussion, kind of no matter what, really? Is the investment in phase 1 throwaway investment, or is it still have value in the future, even if the two entities come together?
Right, that's a good question. So what we have negotiated with ecology in terms of time to make this decision is of the approved funding agreement, and the phase 1 project is currently approved. College Place is currently planning on doing just a portion of the phase 1 project this coming year. The stuff that would be needed either way. There are some upgrades that are needed either way, regardless of what direction we go. So we're going to focus on those upgrades now. And we have until, I forget the exact date. I want to say it's the end of 2025.
December 20.
Okay, December 2025. That's the due date in this funding agreement with ecology to make a decision. Either College Place decides to do this partnership with Walla Walla and commits to spending the rest of the unspent budget on that project, or we come to the decision, nope, we can't do it. We're just going to go ahead and build phase 1 as currently approved. So that timeline is built into this decision. What else was I going to say about that? I think in terms of timing of other aspects of that, the plan would be, if we can come to some sort of an agreement by the end of 2025 that we think is worth pursuing, the rest of that budget would then be spent on a pump station and pipe to pump the water from College Place to Walla Walla. And that is the potentially wasted asset that Chris refers to if this doesn't work out. That would be a lot of money that College Place is spent on a piece of infrastructure that might not make sense. And so that's why we're trying to go through this process now, between now and 2025, to decide, is it worth going down that path? And I think part of what complicates the discussion is We're not talking about sending College Place's raw untreated sewage to Walla Walla. We're talking about College Place continuing to operate their wastewater treatment plant, producing a very clean effluent and sending that to Walla Walla. So that is a hybrid scenario in and of itself. We're talking about College Place only needing a small part of Walla Walla's wastewater treatment plant, just the filtration and the disinfection. And so that's why I think what would be really interesting, it would be to do the next step, which is what we had kind of scoped originally and brought in front of the councils, which is let's quantify what that looks like. With the understanding that we're sending clean treated effluent from Walla Walla to College Place, what is the buy-in for the renter model? What's the buy-in for the customer model? What's the buy-in for the joint regionalization model? And I think that initially, when we brought that in front of College Place's council, there was an uneasiness of, well, we don't want to be a renter or a customer. And hopefully with today's presentation, there's an understanding of why it's worth looking at that. Because there's trade-offs between the buy-in cost and the risk associated with that.
Are you saying that if we do a regional, that's all we're going to do? When I say us, College Place, so if we do a regional, that's not what you're talking about, right? Because where we're just sending the effluents over?
That could be part of it eventually, because eventually if, let's just say this happens in a stepwise fashion where we realize there's momentum moving forward. We build a pump station and pipeline that pump the treated effluent to Walla Walla, and it's either a renter or customer agreement in the meantime. If things progress forward into a regional sewer district, then that regional sewer district can decide this works out well, or depending on where the growth is happening, maybe we need to invest more money in College Place's treatment plant if there's more growth there. Or maybe the joint sewer district decides, you know what? We don't need to operate College Place's treatment plant. We think we get better bang for the buck if we pump all the untreated sewage to the main Walla Walla plant. There's different things that the joint sewer district could decide on how to use both of those assets in the future.
Okay.
But that's in that case scenario, then that investment in that pump would not be all for naught. It would still leave room for those options.
Yes. If we were to design the pump station and pipeline for the clean treated effluent, we would size it so that it could also be pump raw sewage either way.
Given whatever the future may hold.
Yes. Yeah.
Councilmember Cleveland?
Kind of one pretty important thing that appears to me is that, like, if we move towards any kind of joint thing, we're pretty committed in the sense that we have chosen not to do necessary upgrades to our system in order to create this pipeline and pump it over there. If we did back out, if there was any kind of conflict, we'd be hurting in a pretty big way.
Yes, I don't recall if we quantified what the proposed cost of that pump station and pipeline is, but that is a significant investment. That would be a wasted asset. And instead, if you decided that this didn't work out and you wanted to go back to being on your own, we would then have to go back to building the pond and the irrigation upgrades and the disinfection upgrades instead. Yes. Thank you.
And Alex, that was kind of where I was going with my question is if College Place stayed the course and built the full gamut of phase one, and then the regulations come down that says you have to treat for PCBs, could we not re-enter this conversation about then, taking that and consolidating in some fashion without throwing away the investment that College Place has to make in phase one? It can still be utilized in that, like you described, you have two plants, and that's utilize those and maximize the benefit. So they stayed the course for phase one, completely built that out with the idea that, if all these regulations come down, we need to explore this.
That's a really good point, Kai, because that's true. College Place could just go ahead and build phase one as currently approved and wait for that new regulation to come. And then that would undoubtedly be part of the decision. Okay, we have to deal with this new regulation. What are the alternatives? We add treatment at College Place's plant, or we reach out and see if we can do something joint with Walla Walla. You're right. That is something that could be decided down the road.
And that's an option. Both cities could be kind of forced into that because PCB regulations for Walla Walla, PCB regulations for College Place, could potentially be forced together to pursue the best option for our two communities together.
That's a really good point. That's a good point. And along those lines, kind of a side conversation, I also wanted to bring up while we're all together here as well, is because ecology has both permits that they need to update at the same time. They need to make a decision about which one they're going to focus on. Walla Walla's or College Place to do first. And so they're on the fence on that. And I think they're kind of spinning their wheels till they make that decision. And if the two councils can come together and kind of make a decision together to decide whether it makes more sense to focus on Walla Walla's permit first, or College Place's permit first, I think that would be helpful to provide that direction to ecology if we can come to that kind of an agreement and give them some direction on that. Kind of a side note, but yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we could always wait and see if and when those PCB regulated and then revisit this discussion and then.
Mr. Cleveland?
Something to consider is that being proactive and working on a plan like this now and enacting it now it would be easier as opposed to doing it during a crisis. If this is going to happen, we have an extremely tight schedule. There's going to be big consequences if we don't get it done on time, kind of stuff. So, I mean, time is on our side at this point. Whereas if we wait, we could be in a situation where there's a lot of duress.
That's true. Yeah.
Councilmember Moss.
Of the 26 million, half for the city of College Place, half is going to come from grants. That's coming from ecology.
It's a mix. So 10 million of the grant is coming from ecology and then 3.5 million from the federal government.
And is there any impact on the grants? If College Place goes down one road and then depending on what the state ecology makes a decision, it takes us down another road.
So the way that the funding agreement right now is written is the funding is allocated for phase one as currently approved. With the understanding that we're reserving the right to spend some of that money on this pump station and pipeline instead. But so either option is funded right now. We have till 2025 to decide which direction to go. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Okay.
But there's not enough money to both.
There is.
Well, that's what I'm.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yes, no, there's not enough money for it.
Or to do partially, and then, like you said, the partially clean at certain times, because then you don't have to put it in Garrison and pump it that way. There's, I was just wondering if there's a happy medium there that could be met between us two, that you were saying is only about part of the time.
Yeah, well, I think that's likely how it would look, depending on what type of a user agreement we come up with. There will only be a need for College Place to pump the effluent to Walla Walla during the winter months.
Right.
Whereas during the summer months, during the growing season, they can apply it to the crops. So they will probably minimize the amount of time they pump it to Walla Walla so that it costs them less money to do so.
Yeah.
Would be my guess and how it will work out.
Mr. Francis?
So you said that College Place has everything they need right now to do phase one, and they would be good for the foreseeable future. What's the foreseeable future? 3 years, 3 weeks, 3 days? What is the foreseeable future?
So the planning period in the facility plan was a 20-year planning period, just in terms of proposed growth for the city. What would complicate that is if a new permit comes out that has some new requirement that has to be dealt with. That's an unknown that we're not sure about. But when we did the facility plan, we looked at 20 years of growth at the city of College Place. That's what the improvements in the facility plan are sized for.
So when you said the new plan comes out, when is is that when you make the upgrades and then you would, and then, or the new permit, is that the foreseeable future when that new permit comes out?
Right, yeah. So, yeah, to be more clear, the phase one upgrades for the City of College Place treatment plant, based on what we know now, should be good for 20 years at the City of College Place. What could change that could be a new condition and a new permit that we're expecting.
Just like we would have.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. And you also said that, with this phase one, there'd be some, you don't have to do all the necessary upgrades. And what upgrades would not be necessary that you would not have to do with this phase one?
So the plan that we're talking about, this is, the initial part of phase one that we're planning on building in the next year or two includes some upgrades to their headworks, some upgrades to some leaky air piping, some upgrades to their equalization basin, and upgrading some electrical panels around the plant. Those are improvements that would be needed either way, and so that's what we're moving forward with now. The improvements, the remainder of the improvements that we would no longer need to do if we were to build a pump station and pipeline include a large storage pond, the UV disinfection system, and some upgrades to the irrigation system at the land treatment area. The other thing is the City of College Place bought another 80-acre piece of property that the storage pond will be located on. And we were going to expand the irrigation system to the new 80 acres as well. Those are all things we would no longer need to do, and we would use that money instead to build the pump station and pipeline to Walla.
Okay, thanks.
I think, Mike, using your words, the boogeyman is that PCB element that is kind of an unknown, undefined at this point in time for both cities. And the timing is somewhat unknown too.
It is, yeah.
And there would be a compliance schedule that would go along with new permit requirements like that, because that's a big thing to put onto any city.
One would hope so, but we should remember that when the TMDL was done on the Walla Walla River, from ecology standpoint, there was a grace period built into that. It was in the early 2000s, I think, that the TMDL was completed. And the dates of compliance that are set in the TMDL are set and they aren't negotiable. And so we're stuck to comply with those. And so sometimes hands can be tied when it comes to that. So I wouldn't count on necessarily a grace period associated with it. One would hope there would be, but not necessarily.
I think either I'm stuck in my teacher brain, or I'm just a simpleton, because I need to do some homework on all the past presentations in which you've done. And I didn't know if this is entirely possible, if this is a good question, but it helped me with this kind of a decision, or maybe perhaps I'll help others. It's almost like I need to see like a clear list of needs, wants, desires. And included in that is just we can't put our thumb on it, but we know the regulation things are coming. That's just the way it looks. And in that case, then say, okay, what's the costs and or current needs that would fulfill the needs, wants, and desires? And then that would tell me, okay, I have the needs, wants, and desires of this system and or the two cities. We know what's now and what's coming, or where the gaps are to fulfill the needs, wants, and desires. And then from that would help inform my brain into saying, okay, well, knowing this and knowing the costs, then we would look at 2 or 3 of these models and see which one is giving us a starting point or a framework that would fulfill the needs, wants, and desires. Does that make sense? So it's almost like a list, like for the last 2 or 3 meetings we've been doing there, it's extremely informative, but it's almost like we're informative in various branches. And I just need to see okay, here's a must. Here's a need of our cities. And here's a future desire likely. Here's what we can handle in terms of cost. And from that, does the customer model, partner model, regionalization, whatever, fulfill those needs that are coming? Is that making sense?
Not entirely.
Okay,
Look, each of these different models meets our needs, but they have different pros and cons.
that's kind of what I'm hoping to do is like, there's all these different factors and these kind of knowns and unknowns and so on and so forth. It's almost like we need to break it down and say, okay, if we go X path, boom, boom, boom happens. We go this X path, boom, boom, boom happens. To help, instead of just trying to wrap in my mind about like, it's almost like we're having discussions versus going somewhere with it in terms of making a decision on a governance model.
Mike, you have.
Yeah, well, I mean, we can do a little chart with it, but really what it's happened to, it isn't really a desire, it's a need, and depending on which route you go, you could accidentally essentially forsake assets. So for instance, like, like with the potential regionalization with Walla, let's say if there was an off ramp there, well, then you have a pipe that essentially you aren't doing nothing with. However, flipping it the other way, let's say we just well, oh, we're just gonna do phase one, and whenever Calgy decides to hit us in the face with this, we'll play chicken with them. What could happen at that point is that we may still have to do a pipe, and then all those improvements we did, digging the giant lake out on the 80 acres and all of that, we just built a giant lake that's not gonna achieve anything, and then we're still having to do a pipe, so.
Yes,
yeah.
what you're, yes, that's what I'm getting at right there.
Yeah.
Is those two things.
Yeah.
Having those clear cut, like, we do this. Here's what's gonna happen. If we do this, what's gonna happen, and then we can hone in and say, okay, well, it seems to me that we need to attack this model. And that will help us do this.
Yeah, because the difference,
Prioritize,
yeah,
yes.
the difference in decision is the threat of having a pipe that isn't doing anything versus a lake that's not doing anything.
Perfect.
So.
Mike, my
yeah.
interpreter, thank you.
Midwest interpreter.
That's it, yes, thank you.
Mr. Carlton?
Alex, have you done some cost estimates on what the pump station and pipeline would cost?
We did, we put those together as part of that regionalization study. I don't have it in front of me now. I mean, I hate to find a number off the top of my head, but I want to say it's probably around $15 million.
So that would be the lost cost.
Yeah, the reason
cost we'd have to incur if we went through all of phase one and then had 5-10 years down the road, we had to go do a pump, it would cost us $15 million.
Yeah.
And
That's our basic issue.
Roughly.
yeah, and then the lake had cleaned up fluid in the farm and up there, that was about roughly 13. So that's essentially the two cost things we're dealing with here.
And I think I tried to explain it earlier with what a next step might be, and to simplify that as best as possible, you're trying to compare apples to apples. What's the cost of this apple, what's the cost of this apple, and maybe there's a third apple in there, because it can get really complicated with all these different options and variables and elements. That's why I said is as best as we can, let's try to compare those three options over some time period and the expense of those. So what is it, boiling that down into dollars today, what is Apple 1, Apple 2, and Apple 3?
I like it. Yeah, that's simple, for me, thank you.
Ms. Chamberlain, did you have any questions or comments? No. Okay, Councilman,
With regard to PCBs, those discussions are well beyond the state of Washington.
Yes,
They're national.
yeah, it's mandated from EPA. Yeah.
So there will be some regulations. We just don't know when and how stringent. Is that?
Yes, that's fair to say. I mean, I think it will be a problem to solve. We just don't know how big of a problem. We don't really know when.
so Councilmember Williams, who is not here, submitted some questions. And so I'm just gonna kind of go through some of them, and if they're not relevant, just say it's not relevant to this conversation, and we don't have to, waste time, but she just had some, and she broke them down in technical, legal, political, and financial. So I'll go with the shortest. Is there, is a vote required of the citizens to do this?
if we go on regionalization, well, any of three,
Yeah, I'm not sure, Chris, do you know that one?
I'm sorry, do I know what?
if any three options require a vote of the citizens?
Oh, for this, I don't think so. I mean, this is just a contract service. Well, the first two are contract service relationships between the cities. And then, yeah, I mean, I don't think a vote would be needed to form a regional entity. I don't think Cascade Water Alliance got a vote for that. It's just a contract between agencies.
Okay. What would a rate study that combines College Place and Walla Walla customers into one system cost, and should we consider that?
So you said, what would a rate study combine?
What would a rate? Yeah, that just combines College Place and Walla Walla customers into one system cost.
Oh. You mean for the purpose of evaluating this, or in general? Because I mean, we had given a proposal to look at the three models. And then, I mean, if we're just doing a rate study that combine them all, I mean, I feel like it would cost about what we would charge for a normal rate study, I mean, once the system was combined.
Yeah, the cost of the previous effort was 25,000, is that what it was, Kai?
From FCS?
Yeah.
No, it was, I think, closer to double that.
Oh, okay.
40, 50, somewhere in that range. I think it'll require some of your technical expertise in project in the future.
Okay.
Okay. And then she says, will there be a potential that it would make sense for Walla Walla sometimes to send effluent that needed retreatment or something back to College Place? No.
No, I don't see that being.
Okay. Whether or not oh no, okay, let's move on. Okay, whether or not that happens, does it make sense to have a double pipe rather than one larger pipe? Have two smaller pipes for redundancy to ease maintenance, etc.
So the scenario of Walla Walla pumping sewage or effluent to College Place, I don't think that's feasible because Walla Walla has a duty to provide treated effluent to the irrigation districts.
Okay.
They must provide that as part of the water right. So that scenario of Walla Walla sending sewage or effluent to College Places is unlikely in my mind.
And Councilmember Williams is our engineers. Okay, with Walla Walla's need to upgrade, how long does it take? How long does the flow equalization provided by College Place help Walla Walla with their plant? In other words, what parts of the College Place plants would still be needed after the upcoming upgrade?
So I suspect what she's getting at, when we did the regionalization feasibility study, there were two things we looked at. One was pumping untreated sewage from College Place to Walla Walla. That was one thing we had looked at. And in that scenario, the existing concrete tanks at College Place's plant could be used to store that sewage during the day and pump it to Walla Walla at night when there's extra capacity at Walla Walla's plant. In that case, that's true. There is some equalization storage associated with that scenario. However, in the scenario that we're talking about now, it's kind of evolved since then where College Place would continue operating their plant in entirety and only pump treated effluent to Walla Walla. So they're kind of two different scenarios.
Okay, should collection systems be included?
Yeah, I'm not sure about these other examples, and maybe Chris knows that. I'm not sure if he does. If these other partnerships included just the treatment plants or if they included the collection systems as well. I'm not sure about that.
So the ones I can speak to, Longview and Beacon Hill Water and Sewer District. I don't know that it included the entire system, but it included the treatment plant, and it included the transmission infrastructure that was used to get water to Beacon Hill. So it was a combination of supply and transmission. Blaine and Birch Bay is the same thing. They're allocated wells and as well as a share of the pipes. Spokane County and Millwood, that one's basically just a retail relationship. Sumner and Bonnie Lake, I think it's just the treatment plant. I think each system owns its own collection system. And then let's see, Chehalis and Napavine, Lewis County Sewer District. That one was the treatment plant, but there were also certain pipes that they were allocated, again, based on what was being used to send wastewater to Chehalis's plant. Let's see, lot I can't speak to. Cascade Water Alliance, each member owns its own distribution infrastructure, and the agreement with the members specifies delivery points, and it's up to Cascade to ultimately what they're going to do long term is they have the supply, and they are responsible for the regional transmission infrastructure that's needed to get the water to the specified delivery points.
Okay. Legal question, the utility will be its own entity, but does that make College Place and Walla Walla customers of the utility, or will Walla Walla and College Place residents be the customers of the utility?
I think Clean Water Services is an example of how it could go either way. I mean, to the bigger cities that Clean Water Services serves, they bill the cities directly, and then the cities bill the customers. And then there are some smaller communities that Clean Water Services serves, and I think they bill the customers directly. So I think, again, it's sort of however the governance agreement is structured. But I mean, I think the way that like Cascade Water Alliance works, it bills the member agencies, and then they include those charges in their retail rates.
Well, I was just going to explain that it simply becomes a lot more complicated when we start including the collection systems, because the financial architecture of each city is different. The interaction and the policies with the customers can be different. So breaking or including all of the collections in with the regional, while it's feasible, now we're talking a lot more complicated of a discussion, because it's not just simply a component of your sewer bill being treatment buried in there.
Sure.
Now you're talking about so many different other aspects that branch into each of our unique cities.
How does this affect the bonds that each city has on their treatment plants? Would the utility assume those, or would they have to make new bonds?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Well, her concern is interest rates going up.
Yeah, I mean, I think what would probably happen, I mean, if assuming that the regional entity would own the assets, I mean, presumably the debt would have to go with it. And I don't know, I mean, you'd probably need to talk to bond counsel and your attorney to figure that out. But I mean, it could be, I mean, the agency has the ability to issue its own debt, and it basically, issues the debt and purchases the assets or whatever from the cities, and sort of pays off the existing debt obligations or whatever. There may be a way to just transfer the obligations over to the new entity. I mean, Lot might have had some of that go on.
And then how would the utility be funded? And she asked, could it issue bonds? And it sounded like it could for that second question, but how would the utility be funded?
So the agency or the utility would have to impose its own charges to generate the revenue that it needs. And so, whether it charges Cascade, for example, Cascade charges its members, agencies, and then they will then recover the costs imposed on them from their retail customers. Or like the Clean Water Services example, there might be rates and charges that apply directly to customers if that's how the billing is set up.
Okay, so I'm just gonna pick one, the last one. How would new sewer service areas in the UGAs factor into the utility?
How do the UGAs factor into the utility? I mean, I would think that, as growth were to happen in those areas, I mean, they would ultimately be responsible for meeting the demands, which would include, I mean, both cities have to plan for their UGAs.
Okay. There's more, but I'm just gonna leave it at that. Okay. All right. Okay, so I see. Are there any other questions? Does anybody have any other questions? And Sherry, can you let me know if anyone online has questions? Does Walla have a preference? What's that? No. Okay. Does Walla have a preference in what direction they would like to see this go?
You want me to answer or Steve, or do you want to?
I'll answer for Steve.
I have some excellent
I'd like to
recommendations.
see, personally, I'd like to see each of the two cities assign 2 or 3 council members and some of these really intelligent, knowledgeable engineers that know what they're talking about and go about over the next, pick a time frame, 9 to 12 months and do some research and come back with some answers to a lot of these good questions that we've heard today. That's just me.
So I think Steve was reading my notes. That's why I said subcommittee of each council is one of our next steps. And I would also add to that is the scope of work that we had put together with FCS and Alex. And we need to move forward with that because that's going to answer I think a lot of the financial pieces of the questions that were raised today. So I would suggest a subcommittee of each council. We need to execute that agreement and start working towards some answers to some of the questions that were raised today.
Yeah. I think well, I know I agree. I can't put the council for the subcommittee. Okay, any other questions or comments? What time is it?
9:46.
Oh, we're past time, huh? What time was it scheduled until 6? Okay, all right. So if there's no other comments or anything else for good of the order,
Just a thank you.
thank you all for being here and your patience. We appreciate that.
Thanks, Alex, as well.
All right, I will conclude this workshop at 5:47 p.m. Thanks, everybody.